Hello folks, I'm Alex, this is Alex Unabridged, and these are my thoughts on Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham. So welcome back to the channel if that is the case. Yes, time for my thoughts on some more classic sci-fi as part of my science fiction for the somewhat hesitant series. And today it's the turn of a very British classic, which is The Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham from 1951. And so in this we meet Bill Mason, who at the time of us meeting him has just woken up in hospital in London with his eyes bandaged. He's just had some treatment for an injury sustained from his work with the titular triffids that are giant, poisonous, carnivorous, bioengineered plants that can move, basically, that humans have been cultivating for their very valuable oil. The book opens with a great first line, which is, when a day that you happen to know is Wednesday starts off by sounding like Sunday, there is something seriously wrong somewhere. And he's very right, there is something seriously wrong. Bill takes the bandages off his eyes. He can't find any staff in the hospital. Everything's quiet. Finds that he can see, and so goes out into the city to figure out what's going on. And he discovers that everyone who's observed a strange meteor shower the previous night has been rendered blind. As he navigates the city, Bill rescues another sighted woman named Gisela from a blinded man who has enslaved her, has got her tied up, and he's forcing her to forage for food and resources for him. And so together, Bill and Gisela start to look for the best way out of the city and start to consider how they might survive in this rather bleak new world in which society is irrevocably changed and where they face numerous threats from the Triffids, of course, from disease, and also, as with any kind of apocalyptic situation, from other people. So there's your basic summary of Day of the Triffids. So what did I think then? Yeah, now we're talking. I loved this. I thought this was excellent. This was thoroughly enjoyable. It's quite bleak. I do like a bit of bleak stuff, but it's not without hope. I think the balance there is really good, and it's certainly not without humour as well. There's some really great dry humour, observational humour, sort of anecdotal humour in there. It feels very human. It's very, very British, and I do enjoy that. Very, very British of a particular sort of era as well. The Triffids play a much smaller role in it than the title might suggest, and certainly smaller role than I expected. It's the human threat, really, the threat of this kind of collapse of civilization that's the biggest danger here. But I didn't have a problem with the fact that the Triffids was somewhat a kind of a menace lurking in the background. The story and the ideas generally in it are excellent, I thought. To be honest, I think it would have been a great story about the sort of end of civilization, even without the giant carnivorous plants. But they definitely added an interesting and, say, menacing kind of lurking threat in the background as well, this extra layer. One thing to note with it is that it is very much of its age when it comes to certain attitudes. That there's some good old 1950s sexism in there. Yeah, the attitudes from the period are on show, I think, but it didn't diminish my enjoyment of it, I have to say, because I kind of look at it in terms of it's part of the historical context of the book. I expected a certain level of sexism in there, so I can kind of take it for what it is in terms of it is of its era. But yeah, it's told from Bill's perspective. It's his account of what happened to him, as well as him kind of briefly recounting some of the stuff that happens to some of the other people that he meets, he interacts with. You know, sort of they tell him their story, he tells us their story. So we kind of find out what happened to them kind of off stage, if you like. Bill in particular feels very three-dimensional. He comes across as a living, breathing, thinking, feeling person. He's relatable, he's got, you know, he's flawed, he worries about whether he's doing the right thing. He, you know, tries to think about the complexity of the situation. He feels very much like a real person. And to be honest, most of the characters do in this. You know, there's just a handful that we get to know better. Bill, certainly, I felt like I knew him properly by, you know, we're quite quick into it because we get some of his background, we get stuff about, you know, what he does. He's a biologist, he's been working with TRIFFIDS, you know, and some of his stuff about his relationship with his father. And so we get sort of more about him generally, as well as just how he's reacting in the situation. And we do with people like Gisela as well. She's a novelist who wrote a bit of a saucy book, you know, and we get little bits about some of the other characters as well. But there is only a real handful that you kind of get any kind of real handle on, but they do feel very much real, you know, they do feel well developed. The setting of it is and the kind of the situation is really well developed as well and very believable. It's plausible. You know, even the Triffids, there is enough of sort of scientific explanation within there from Bill as the biologist that lends a weight to them and their existence. You know, it makes them believable in a believable world. The atmosphere in this is outstanding. I thought I loved it. It's one of my favorite things about it. I think it's, as I say, it's bleak, it's dark, it's creepy, it's somber, but it's got hope there and it's got humor there. So yeah, I can see why it's so popular, and I can see why it's influenced so much stuff, you know, since. Like, it's got definite, like, 28 Days Later vibes, or at least I should say that 28 Days Later has definite Day of the Triffids vibes. You know, it's I don't know anything about, you know, kind of what inspired Danny Boyle to make 28 Days Later, but I'm gonna guess that Day of the Triffids certainly had some influence there, especially in the opening sort of parts, the opening part of 28 Days Later. It feels like a definite homage to Day of the Triffids and the opening of it, because they feel so similar. It wasn't hard at all to visualise the setting. The descriptive strength of Wyndham's writing put me in the world immediately. It helps that it's London and I do know London. You know, yes, okay, I know, you know, 21st century London and not 1950s London, but it's not that different. But it's not just in terms of this sort of the sense of physical place that he's so good at describing, but how it feels, and how it makes the characters feel, or at least how it makes Bill feel. I've got a quote for that. This is when Bill's kind of wandered into sort of the Westminster area, and he's near the Abbey, and he's kind of taking in what's kind of left of the city. Marvellously clear-fretted in the unsmoked air, the Abbey rose, silver-grey. It stood detached by the serenity of age from the ephemeral growths around it. It was solid on a foundation of centuries, destined, perhaps, for centuries yet, to preserve within it the monuments to those whose work was now all destroyed. I did not loiter there. In years to come, I expect some will go to look at the old Abbey with romantic melancholy. But romance of that kind is an alloy of tragedy with retrospect. I was too close. I really, really like that paragraph, that little description of what it is to stand in front of something and acknowledge that everything that's led, you know, everything that led up to the building of this place and beyond it has now just been destroyed overnight, essentially, that there's nothing left. I think that the way that Wyndham describes the setting is really, really great. I love his style generally, I have to say. There's definite poetry to it. and the structure of his sentences and word choices give the writing a distinct feel. His vocabulary is brilliant. I felt that he always found the perfect word for what he wanted to convey. Very, very evocative language. It's very accessible though. It's very easy to read, or at least very easy to listen to when you listen, because I was listening to the audiobook. And it's got a lovely rhythm to it, and it really sucks you in, I found. And as I say, it's got a great sense of humour as well to go along with the more sombre tone for a lot of it. The humour is quite understated, but it works. I think it works really well in adding that touch of lightness to what is often kind of this dark and serious subject matter. Like for instance, at one point later on, Bill meets a young girl called Susan, who's kind of been left with nothing. She can see, and it's, you know, the I won't say what happens or what has happened to her, because that would be a spoiler, but she's left on her own basically, and Bill finds her, and the bit that, you know, that sort of little section where he finds her and finds out what's happened to her, that's actually really quite sad. It's a sad and serious moment. But then he takes her off and she travels with him, and you know, we get this kind of paragraph that just lightens the mood again nicely, just really simply. I prospected a cottage or two until I found one that was fit, and then we set about getting a meal together. I did not know much of small girls, but this one seemed to be able to dispose of an astonishing quantity of the result, confessing while she did so that a diet consisting almost entirely of biscuits, cake and sweets had proved less completely satisfying than she had expected. Like, there's a lot of observations about Susan, and Susan herself is a really, really lovely character actually. We see, you know, kind of later on in the book. And the way that Wyndham writes about Susan and children generally as well is being, you know, as being quite, you know, so resilient and resourceful in terms of in mind. That's kind of a really hopeful part of it generally, this kind of hope for the future. The voices that Wyndham gives to the characters in generally makes the characters distinct. The character of Coker is a great example of this. You know, he's an orator really, and the way he speaks, you know, his language patterns, his vocabulary, you know, his kind of approach to things really gives you a sense of who he is, as well as his philosophy on the world and on its future and all that kind of stuff. So it's really successful, that the way that Wyndham writes, I think. In terms of the story, it kind of, in some respects, it appears quite simple in terms of, you know, it's man wakes up and discovers that a catastrophe has happened, that the world he knew no longer exists, and he needs to survive in this new world. You know, it's quite a simple plot in that respect, in an overarching kind of plot. But there's a hell of a lot going on in terms of sort of events within that. There's a lot of kind of Bill travelling around, a lot of him coming up against various different sort of hurdles, different problems, different dangers, etc. There's a lot of detail in those things that happen to Bill, and then we get stuff that's happened to other people as well, and you know, the things that he has to do as he tries to find this some sort of a safe haven. But it progressed quite naturally. It didn't feel overdone to me, because it was all very interesting, and each kind of beat or plot point kind of gave Wyndham a chance to kind of introduce or discuss sort of ideas, themes, philosophy that he wanted to. So it's kind of, and it does work well. It never felt slow. It's quite a medium paced book, I think. The pacing was good. It's steady. It's steady, but don't expect lots of action. You get bits, but it's just, you know, it ticks along basically. It's not all up and down all the time, but there is some tension, there is some action, and there's quite a lot of reflective stuff as well. And in terms of the reflective stuff and the ideas, themes, etc., there is a lot at play here, in terms of philosophy, sociological debate. I won't go into too much detail because I'd be here for hours. It was written during the Cold War, so there are the usual themes that I'd kind of expect to find within sort of that kind of apocalyptic story of that sort of era. Wyndham asks some pretty complex questions through the characters, And some of the ones that I kind of found most valuable really are things like morality, the morality questions. So like Bill's own discussion with himself as well as others, sort of regarding what the most sort of moral action is when it comes to being sighted in a world full of newly blind people who essentially can't really fend for themselves anymore. This question, a question that he constantly has is, should he devote himself to helping the blind people, to just try and help a handful of people survive as long as possible, which really only serves to kind of slow their eventual demise, or should he abandon them to their own fate, and focus on kind of building a new life, finding a new group to form a new society with, to try and ensure the survival of the human race. That constant kind of up and down that he has in terms of what's the morally right thing to do. That's quite interesting. That goes back and forth a lot. The way that Wyndham talks about the need to adapt in a new society, how we're hard-coded to behave in certain ways, ethically speaking, socially, etc., in our sort of current society, and how we might find changing the behaviours, those kind of behaviours in the event of that kind of collapse of society. Whether that's having to essentially steal something from a shop to survive, even though there's no shop owner anymore, everything's kind of gone to hell. Still, that act of not paying for something, that act of just taking something, that act of kind of being, I need this to survive, so I'm going to take it over someone else having it. Ideas of kind of religion and traditional kind of ways of living in terms of marriage, family, etc., versus having to be much more kind of progressive in terms of what's the best way to ensure kind of the survival of humanity, even if that goes against some of the traditional norms. That kind of thing's really interesting to me. The Triffids themselves, I think, are a really interesting kind of thing. They obviously bring in questions of nature and science and kind of humanity's hubris in engineering these things and thinking that you can always control them until you can't. There are so many different ideas in this. That's just a handful that I've touched on. There's also plenty of stuff about loneliness and the need for what happens when a social animal like humans are left kind of on their own. It's like there's so much else in there. As I say, I'd be here forever if I went through all of it. But I really appreciated the amount of questions that Wyndham kind of asks. But yeah, it's the way that he discusses these ideas, raises these questions, that I think is really successful for me in terms of them coming through the characters, very much through the characters' own internal questioning and discussions with themselves, as well as debates and conversations amongst kind of groups of characters, factions, things like that. So my enjoyment then, I loved it. I really loved it. I thought it was a really thought-provoking book. I really enjoyed the tone of it, the atmosphere of it, the fact it was so easy to read. Once I started, I wanted to read it. I wanted to listen to it, all the time. It's got some great prose in it. I really like Wyndham's style. So yeah, really, really enjoyed this one. I thought I probably would, but not necessarily as much as I did. So to give it a rating then, I will pop my ratings up on screen to go through the individual kind of elements of the storycraft, if you like, to start with. Character, I've given a 9 out of 10 for this. I thought, like, Bill particularly was extremely strong in terms of how I felt I knew so much about him and how I felt I knew the character. He felt very real, and as I say, the others felt real enough as well, definitely, but I really thought Bill particularly was excellent. Atmosphere, I've given it a 10 out of 10. It's one of the most atmospheric books I think I've read in a long time. One of the most evocative books. Writing wise, it's an 8 out of 10. I really like Wyndham's style. I definitely want to read more. Plot, I've given it an 8 out of 10. To say its overarching plot is quite a simple one, but it's full of lots of smaller events that really just play into your greater understanding of the world, etc., all that kind of stuff. The ideas, I've given a 9 out of 10. As I say, there's a ton of them. There's a lot of interesting questions in there, and just the way that they actually were conveyed. And my enjoyment is also a 9 out of 10. I thought it was excellent, and I thoroughly enjoyed my time with it. So if we add all of those up and divide by 6, we get a overall score of 8.83 out of 10. I will round that up to a 9 out of 10, and that will go on Storygraph as a 5-star. So another 5-star rating, another 9 out of 10 from me in this science fiction series for me. So yeah, really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed seeing how much it's influenced other stuff. As I say, I've already talked about 28 Days Later, but zombie stuff generally, I think, like The Walking Dead, that kind of thing. Even Shaun of the Dead, though, I think Shaun of the Dead certainly took some inspiration there. And certainly even just, what do you do when the world's collapsing, society's collapsing? You go to the pub. And that's what Bill does. One of the first things Bill does when he gets out of hospital, he goes and he finds a pub and has a drink. But yeah, it's I really enjoyed sort of getting to know this one, and I can see where the influence is. I can see why it's been so influential, why it's been so popular. I noticed that all of Wyndham's, or majority of Wyndham's books are on Audible Plus catalogue, which I have access to. So I'm definitely going to read more. In fact, I had to resist temptation to just go, TBR be damned, I'm reading another one right now. Because yeah, now I've kind of started, I think I'll probably whip through them reasonably quickly. I'm probably going to put one on next month's TBR, just to warn you, because they're not that long either. So yeah, definitely an author that I will be reading more of, and soon. So that will do from me today. Thank you very much for watching, as always, folks. Drop your thoughts in the comments, particularly for those of you who have read more Wyndham. What is your favourite? And which one should I read next? Because as I say, I have access to pretty much all of them. So if you've got any thoughts on that, let me know in the comments. I will be back on Sunday with my TBR for April. There are no less than 3 reading events that I want to take part in April. So yeah, that could be a biggie. In fact, I think it's probably going to be a pile of possibilities, just so that I don't, break myself by trying to read too much. So yeah, I think I'll make it a pile of possibilities rather than a TBR. But yeah, do join me for that in a couple of days. But from me, for now, that's ta-ra.